the first session in the adolescent medicine track, which is focusing on...
I'm sorry,
yeah.
1 second. Is that...
Oh, will you tell me when we're ready to go live? Yeah.
Go.
Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this first session in the adolescent medicine track, which is focusing on adolescent mental health. Delighted that you're able to join us this morning. My name is Jo INCHLEY, and I'm a reader at the University of Glasgow in Scotland and a public health researcher focusing specifically on child and adolescent mental health. I will be presenting in this session as well, along with my two colleagues here. So CATHY CRESWELL, who is Professor of Developmental Clinical Psychology at the University of Oxford, and Professor Rory O'Connor, who is Professor of Health Psychology at University of Glasgow. So the way the session will run is that we'll each give our presentation first, and there will be a panel discussion at the end. So each presenter will speak for around 25 to 30 minutes, and we'll have some time for questions after that. But please do submit your questions during the presentations, and we'll be able to put them to each of the presenters at the end. So I will get started now by sharing my screen. So hopefully you can all see that. So my presentation is really just to set the scene and give an overview of mental health and adolescence, looking at recent trends. What do we know about mental health and well-being amongst the adolescent population? And by adolescence, I'm really talking about the 10 to 19-year-old age group. And I want to look at maybe some of the reasons for some of the trends that we're seeing. So the learning outcomes for this session are to highlight recent trends in adolescent mental health and well-being, as I said, and review some of the possible explanations for recent trends, and to finish up by considering implications for policy and practice, and also for research. So why is mental health so important during the adolescent years? Well, we know that mental health is obviously a critical part of health and well-being more generally, and is essential for healthy development during the adolescent period, and also for healthy transition into adulthood. It's also the period where young people start to become more independent and develop independent habits, which can either pose a risk for mental well-being or be protective of mental well-being. And we know that there's many of those behaviours and habits that are established during the adolescent years can support mental health and well-being. So things like physical activity, good sleep patterns, stress management, and also developing supportive relationships with friends and significant adults. We know, of course, that many mental illnesses, including things like depression, anxiety, eating disorders, and substance use and psychosis first appear before the age of 24 years. And in fact, half of all mental health conditions start by the age of 14. And globally, it's estimated that around 10 to 20% of adolescents will experience mental health conditions. But at the same time, we know that many of those remain undiagnosed, and many young people will struggle to access appropriate services and treatment. Again, globally, mental health conditions account for around 16% of the burden of disease and injury amongst adolescents. And depression is one of the leading causes of illness and disability in this age group. And we know as well that suicide is a leading cause of death in 15 to 19-year-olds. I think the other thing to say that's important in terms of background is that young people today are living in a rapidly changing social environment, and that can result in huge pressures which can affect their mental health and well-being. So we're talking about digitalization, globalization, migration, urbanization, some of these major global trends that actually have a big impact on young people and how they live their day-to-day lives. We also know that many risk factors for poor mental health actually sit outside of the individual themselves. So there's a wide range of broader social determinants which impact on young people's health and mental health in particular. So that would be things like poverty. So we know that young people growing up in poverty and disadvantage are more likely to experience mental health problems. Family relationships, school experience, so things like school pressure, and also bullying, all impact on young people's experience of mental health and well-being. As I said, we know that many young people are unable to access appropriate services for help when they need them. So if we're going to make a difference to young people's mental health and well-being, we really need to understand where the needs are and focus on where the needs are greatest and take into account these broader factors which are driving the trends that we're seeing today. So what does the evidence tell us about adolescent mental health? And is there really a kind of worsening in mental health? Those of us in the UK will have seen numerous media reports about the situation. I'm sure that's happening in other countries as well. So if you look at the published literature, then there's various studies that have analysed long-term trends and cross-national studies to look at this picture. So for example, in the US, Jean Twenge and colleagues analysed longitudinal data from 2010 to 2015, and they reported an increase in depressive symptoms, suicide-related outcomes, and suicide rates among 13 to 15-year-olds. Bohr and colleagues conducted a review of 19 population-based cohort studies from 12 countries, and they found evidence for increasing internalizing problems among adolescent girls in particular. There was mixed evidence for boys, and there was very little evidence of increasing burden of externalizing problems. In the UK, Collishaw carried out a significant review back in 2015 and found that a number of studies suggest what he called non-trivial increases in the prevalence of youth emotional problems, and also found similar findings from other high-income countries. And earlier this year, Cosma and colleagues published a paper on trends in psychosomatic complaints across a number of European countries and found a small linear increase at combined level, but when you look at a country level, there was a significant increase in 26 countries. Interestingly, there was a decrease in psychosomatic complaints in 3 countries, and then some countries also showed no significant change, and that was between 2002 and 2018. Again, in the UK, so this was a study that was published in 2019 by Pitchforth and colleagues. And this looked at prevalence of long-standing conditions, taking data from the Scottish Health Survey, the Health Survey for England, and the Welsh Health Survey. So you can see from the graph on the right, the top bars are any long-standing condition, health condition, and the bars at the bottom of the graph are any long-standing mental health condition. So while we see a kind of mixed pattern for England, Scotland, and Wales in terms of any long-standing health condition, what we do see is a clear increase in long-standing mental health conditions. And in Scotland, that was particularly marked, so an increase from 2.8% to 6.5% over an 11-year period. And in fact, the largest increases were amongst the 13 to 15-year-old and 16+ age groups. When you start to look at it by age, then amongst the younger children aged 4 to 12, long-standing mental health conditions and high total scores on the Strength and Difficulties questionnaire were more common amongst boys. But amongst the older age group, though long-standing mental health conditions were more common amongst boys, girls were actually more likely to report high SEQ scores on the Emotional Difficulties subscale and lower well-being. So they conclude that their findings are consistent with the previous evidence of increasing rates of mental health diagnoses amongst children and young people in recent decades in many high-income countries. And this is recent data from the US, from the National Alliance on Mental Illness, which shows a very similar picture, in fact. So around 1 in 5 children aged 13 to 18 will have a serious mental illness. 1 in 10 roughly have a mood disorder. Around 1 in 10 also would have a behavioural or conduct disorder, and just under 1 in 10 are diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. And of particular relevance here, I think, is this figure. So the average delay between onset of symptoms and intervention is around 8 to 10 years. So just to kind of backtrack a little bit, I guess the question is, what do we mean by mental health? So it's a broad concept, it's multifaceted, and different disciplines will approach it from different perspectives. And at the top here is the WHO definition of mental health as not just the absence of mental illness, but a state of well-being in which an individual realizes his or her own abilities, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. And I also quite like this definition by the Scottish Government, which is slightly simpler. So it's about mental well-being is about both feeling good and functioning effectively, maintaining positive relationships and living a life that has a sense of purpose. So in its broadest definition, it's got both the kind of feeling effective element and also the functioning, being able to function in a productive and healthy way on a day-to-day basis. But when we look at measurements of mental health and well-being, it is complex, and you'll see in the research literature a number of different conditions and measures are used to monitor mental health and well-being within the adolescent population. So that would include diagnosable disorders, as well as behavioural and emotional conditions, measures of psychological distress, and then also more positive aspects of mental well-being, so things like life satisfaction, happiness, confidence, coping, and subjective measures of subjective well-being in general. So that actually makes it quite hard sometimes to compare different studies and really understand the true picture. It's also important to say, I think, that many mental health conditions will coexist in young people. And we also know that young people with a physical or developmental disorder are much more likely to also have a mental health disorder. And it's helpful to think about mental health as a spectrum. So from healthy and thriving at one end to unwell and possibly experiencing a diagnosed condition at the other end. And all of us, young people and adults alike, will find ourselves somewhere on the spectrum, and that will vary according to different stages of our lives. So in relation to kind of UK data, we know that 1 in 10 children in the UK have a diagnosed mental health condition. So they would be at the unwell end of the spectrum. But there's a lot of young people that are experiencing symptoms but may not yet have a diagnosed condition, who may be struggling on a day-to-day basis with their feelings and to function well. There's also a lot of young people who will be dealing with stress on a day-to-day basis, difficult family situations or difficulties with their friends, but are actually coping and managing to get by and function well at school and in their different contexts. So for example, we have in the UK high numbers of young people reporting high levels of school pressure, but they're actually managing to function reasonably well. And then we also know that many young people are doing very well and report high levels of health and well-being overall. Okay, so what I want to do now is just present some findings from the Health, Behaviour and School-Aged Children study. HBSC is an international study which started in 1983 and initially in 3 countries, and we now have 51 countries involved with a network of over 400 researchers. It's a World Health Organization collaborative study and really provides key evidence around a number of different areas of adolescent health and well-being, particularly health behaviours, risk behaviours, health outcomes, and also looking at the social contexts of health for young people, so school, family, peer relationships, and so on. I'm going to draw on some evidence from the international report that was published earlier this year, Spotlight on Adolescent Health and Wellbeing, with 2 volumes, one presenting some key findings and one presenting key data, which are available online through the WHO website. So we had over 45 countries included in this report and over 220,000 young people represented across 60 different indicators of health and well-being. In terms of mental health and well-being, these are some of the areas that are included. So we look at life satisfaction, we look at self-rated health, and we also look at multiple health complaints, which include both psychological complaints, so feeling low, feeling nervous, irritability, and sleeping difficulties, and somatic complaints, which includes backache, stomachache, headache, and feeling dizzy. So if we look first at life satisfaction, I know it's quite hard for you to see the detail on these charts, but going from right to left, you can see these represent 11-year-olds, 13-year-olds, and 15-year-olds. The girls are in blue, in red, and the boys are in blue. So what you can see here is this presents mean life satisfaction score, which is measured on a scale of 0 to 10 using the Cantrell ladder, which some of you will be familiar with. So it asks young people to rate their overall satisfaction with their life from 0, which represents the worst possible life, to 10, which represents best possible life. You can immediately see there's not that much variation between countries, and the majority of young people are reporting a relatively high mean life satisfaction. You can see that gender differences increase a little bit with age. So by age 15, boys are slightly more likely to report high life satisfaction than girls. And you can see that there's this change with age, decline with age, which is slightly more marked in girls than boys. So at age 11, mean score for girls is 8.2, and that reduces to 7.2 by age 15. And for boys, it's 8.3 at age 11 and 7.6 at age 15. If we have a look at self-rated health, and these graphs represent the proportion who rate their health as excellent, here you can see a bit more cross-country variation, and you can also see larger gender differences. So as young people get older, again, boys are more likely to report higher levels of self-rated health than girls are. So there's more difference between the blue and the red bars at age 15 compared with age 11. And you can see that in the average percentages on the left-hand side. So age 11, 41% of girls are reporting their health as excellent. By age 15, only 1 in 4 are doing so. And for boys, it's 45% at age 11, down to 39% at age 15. So a much smaller decline in self-rated health with age for boys. And then if we look at multiple health complaints, so this is a composite measure made up of those 8 items I mentioned earlier: backache, headache, feeling low, feeling dizzy, and others, for example. So this is the proportion of young people reporting at least one health complaint more than once a week. And here again, you can see there are quite wide country differences, and there are significant gender differences, which increase with age. So that by age 15, in almost all countries, girls are reporting much higher levels of multiple health complaints than boys are. And again, that's represented in the figures that you can see. So for girls, it declines from 33% at age 11 to 52%. Over half of girls at age 15 are reporting multiple health complaints. And for boys, a much smaller change from 27% to 30% at age 15. So we're seeing this much more marked decline in mental health and well-being for girls across a number of different indicators. Interestingly, there's variation across countries as well. So while for some countries their relative position is stable across age groups, in other countries the decline with age is much more marked. So Scotland, for example, as you can see, is in the bottom third of the table at age 11, but by age 15 we're in the top third, which means there's a much more steep decline with age in multiple health complaints than in Scotland than for other countries. So our relative position increases. And when we have a look at the individual health complaints, this graph just shows the situation, represents the percentage or prevalence for girls and boys, girls on the left and boys on the right, for the 8 individual complaints. And it's a little bit hard probably to interpret this graph, but if you can see for the boys on the right, the lines represent the different age groups, 11, 13, and 15. So you can see, first of all, there's very little difference by age group amongst boys, a slight increase amongst 15-year-olds, but not a very big one. And you can also see slightly higher prevalence of things like sleeping difficulties, feeling nervous, and irritability, but prevalence is generally around 20% or lower. Whereas for girls, first of all, you can see there's much more difference by age. So that reflects what I was saying earlier about these more marked declines amongst the girls. And you can see much higher numbers of girls reporting feeling nervous or irritable or feeling low and having sleep difficulties on a regular basis. So 1 in 4 adolescents overall reports feeling nervous, feeling irritable, or having difficulties getting to sleep every week. And when you look specifically at the 15-year-olds, then you can see where these gender differences really lie. So although there are some gender differences in headaches, where girls more likely to report more frequent headaches than boys are, the main differences are really around the psychological symptoms, so irritability, feeling nervous, feeling low, and having sleep difficulties, where there's a marked gender difference amongst our 15-year-olds. And this is combined data from across 45 countries. It's also worth noting that there's also very high inequalities in mental well-being, so socioeconomic inequalities. So what we also find from the HBSC data is that adolescents from less affluent families tend to report consistently lower life satisfaction, poorer self-rated health, and more frequent health complaints. So that's very much in line with other data from other studies. So moving on now to think about why are we seeing this worsening in adolescent mental health in recent years? And there's various ideas being put forward. It may be a fact that there's higher reporting, which is due to lower stigma and increased awareness of mental health problems. But there are some very real social changes that I've alluded to earlier, which I think are having an impact also on young people's well-being. So obviously, social media is a big one where there's lots of discussion about the benefits or the negative aspects of social media and its associations with mental health and well-being. And I think generally the evidence would suggest that while social media use per se is not a problem, where that becomes problematic, then that can be associated with poorer mental well-being. And there's also, of course, potential links with sleeping difficulties with young people using social media late at night and that impacting on their sleep, which may in turn then impact on their mental health. Of course, cyberbullying, with the era of digitalization, cyberbullying has become an increasing problem, and it's something that you can't escape from because it penetrates across all aspects of young people's lives. And in that respect, maybe harder to manage than your traditional face-to-face bullying. We know that young people are reporting higher academic expectations and more school pressure, and that in turn may be having an impact on their mental health and well-being. And there's also wider social cultural changes, which are leading to delayed independence. So Twenge and colleagues and others have written about this, particularly in the States. So this I generation who've grown up in the era of smart technology, but where the key markers of adolescence and the transition to adulthood are being delayed, and there may be more concerns about young people's future and their ability to get a job or to leave home and set up independently on their own. And we also, in light of the global financial crisis back in 2008, there's important economic consequences and widening of inequalities in many countries. So colleagues within the HBSC network have looked at some of these areas and their associations with mental health and wellbeing to help us really understand what might be driving some of the trends that we're seeing today. So Walsh and colleagues investigated associations between clusters of contemporary risk and mental wellbeing in adolescents aged 15 across 37 countries. So they identified 7 key clusters of risk behaviours or risk profiles. So they were substance use and early sex, low social support, insufficient nutrition, sugary food and drink intake, bullying, physical health risk, and social media use. And they concluded that low social support and problematic social media use were the strongest predictors of low life satisfaction and psychosomatic complaints. And you can see the odds ratios there. They also found that exposure to bullying was associated with more psychosomatic complaints, and particularly for girls. And Dierkens and colleagues looked at some of the economic factors that might be driving the trends we're seeing. So they compared national level wealth inequality and income inequality in relation to adolescent mental wellbeing across 17 countries. And looked at both life satisfaction and psychosomatic complaints. So this was data from over 240 4,000 adolescents in 2010, 2014 and 2018. And what they found was that higher levels of national income inequality, but interestingly not wealth inequality, were associated with higher levels of psychological and somatic complaints. They also found that there were larger differences in both psychological symptoms and life satisfaction between higher and lower socioeconomic groups in countries with higher levels of national income inequality. So clear links between poverty and inequality and mental well-being. We've also done some initial analysis in Scotland. So this is Scottish HBSC data, looking at associations between school experience and multiple health complaints. So this reports odds ratios of, so the odds of reporting 2 or more health complaints at least once a week for various different factors. So in relation to the school environment particularly, you can see at the top, the ones that are coloured green are protective, so like those who like school a lot compared to those who don't like school, those who report high teacher support and those who report high classmate support have much lower odds of reporting multiple health complaints, and that's true for both boys and girls. And then at the bottom of the table in red are the factors that create a risk for poorer mental health outcomes. So high school pressure, high teacher expectations and high parental expectations about schoolwork, all associated with higher odds of reporting frequent health complaints. And that was particularly true for high teacher expectations amongst girls, where there's girls reporting high teacher expectations are almost 12 times more likely to report multiple health complaints than those that don't feel those high expectations. So there's a balance in terms of academic expectations, and those experiencing higher levels of school pressure than they can cope with are obviously struggling with their mental health and well-being more often. And similarly, we looked at associations between family life and multiple health complaints. So you can see that many factors within the family domain are protective, so daily family meals, high levels of family support, and being able to communicate with both your mother and your father about things that are that you're worried about are all highly protective. And interestingly, again, this concept of the trusted adult, which we're talking about more and more within this field. So having someone to talk to about personal problems is highly relevant. So for young people who don't have anyone they could talk to about personal problems, girls in particular are 12 times more likely to report multiple health complaints, and for boys, they're 5 times more likely. So it reflects the importance of the social environment and having those strong social networks and relationships to help support mental health and well-being. So just moving on now, before I run out of time completely, to look at some of the implications for policy and practice. Just a few final reflections on what the evidence is showing us and where can we go, whether we're in research or whether we're in clinical practice, what are the implications for us? So first of all, it's clear that mental health problems are very common amongst the adolescent population. So although, as Terence mentioned earlier, adolescents are generally pretty healthy as in terms of the phase of the life course, we know that mental health problems develop during this phase and are very common. And that's particularly true for older girls and for low socioeconomic groups. There is also good evidence, I think, that many aspects of adolescent mental health have been worsening in recent years, and that's particularly true in high-income countries. In low and middle-income countries, we know that the psychiatric burden is high, but we lack good evidence. So there is a need for better data and increased investment in a workforce and support services in many LMIC countries. We know it's really important to focus on early intervention and prevention, so as well as looking at early detection and treatment. So population level approaches to really reach young people before these problems escalate and give them the skills and coping mechanisms they need to manage their mental health well. We also need to take a multi-level approach which addresses some of these underlying social determinants of health. So we know that family, we know that school, we know that poverty, all these factors that drive mental health and well-being patterns and trends within the adolescent population. So we need to be addressing all these underlying issues. Healthcare settings themselves provide an opportunity to identify adolescents who may be at risk, and particularly some of the most vulnerable, so those with physical or developmental conditions, for example. And it's really important that young people have access to appropriate services and support across a whole variety of settings, which would include health services, but also schools and communities. And this model represents the child and adolescent mental health services sort of structure within Scotland and the UK more widely, showing the kind of range of different services and support that's needed to effectively manage and support young people's mental health and well-being, ranging from Tier 1, which includes population level universal services across a range of different community health and school settings, up to highly specialised inpatient CAM services and intensive treatment within the community. And just for those of you who may be working within a paediatric context, you might be interested that the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health recently released this new document about the role of paediatricians in supporting children and young people's mental health. So that's available from the RCPCH website. And they also give some top tips as to how clinicians can help support young people's mental health and well-being within a kind of clinical context. So these include things like making every contact count. So making sure that whatever the reason you're seeing a young person, that you're checking in on their mental health and well-being and other aspects of their wider life. Signposting young people and their families to different sources of support out with health services setting, and making sure that they know where to go for pathways of support if required. Encouraging mentally healthy habits, so that would include things like being outside, being physically active, eating well, and ensuring that you're interacting and have good social networks around you. And finally, supporting good child health research and data collection to ensure we can sustain the evidence base and enable us to inform future development of policies and practice to support young people. So I'm going to leave it there. And I'll stop sharing my screen. Thank you for your attention. And I'm now going to hand over to CATHY CRESWELL for the second presentation. So while CATHY's getting her screen up, let me just give you a little bit of an introduction to CATHY. So CATHY is, as I said earlier, Professor of Developmental Clinical Psychology at the University of Oxford in England. She's also an honorary consultant psychologist, and her research focuses particularly on the development, maintenance, and treatment of anxiety disorders. And she's also led a number of COVID-19 responsive studies in response to the pandemic, which are particularly looking at young people's mental health and well-being. So thank you, CATHY. I'll hand over to you.
Great, thanks very much, Jo. And I'm definitely going to be picking up on quite a lot of the themes that you've spoken about. I mean, the first one is one of your main messages, really, which is about, obviously, prior to the pandemic, we already were seeing very high levels of mental health problems among children and young people. So from data from England in 2017, 1 in 9 children and young people were found to have a probable mental health disorder. And actually that reflected a 49% increase in emotional disorders since 2004. And as Jo said, that was very much of that was accounted for by particularly high levels of anxiety disorders and low mood amongst adolescent females. And now the pandemic has obviously brought a number of challenges for young people. So obviously huge disruption to schooling, social isolation, and an increased sense of threat in the environment, amongst other things. So it's obviously really important for us to understand the impacts that's had on young people's mental health. And the challenge has been, of course, is having research that can keep up with the pace of change that we're going through at the moment. But one study that's been particularly helpful has been a follow-up of that NHS digital study that had an existing cohort who had that was a representative of England, where there was extensive information about prior mental health difficulties. And in a recent follow-up in July 2020, so when we were sort of out of our first lockdown, main national lockdown in England, but still under a lot of restrictions, at this stage, 1 in 6 children and young people were found to have a probable mental health disorder. So a marked increase from 2017. Of course, from this data, we don't know whether that is a direct result of the pandemic, because as we saw, we were already seeing a sort of continuation and increase in mental health problems over time. So does this reflect a further increase that would have happened anyway? Or has that been heightened by the pandemic? It's obviously really hard to know, but one of the things that suggests that the pandemic certainly is likely to have contributed is that 40% of young people in that survey did report that they felt that the pandemic had had a negative impact on their mental health. So we've been trying to do some work to pull together the literature on the impacts of the pandemic. And oh, sorry, it looks like the edges of this have been cut off the screen. So I'll just make sure, I'll just say everything out loud. So one of the projects we're doing at the moment is called CORE, which is about working with young people to create resources for young people that address their mental health needs in the COVID context. So we're working with young people to draw together evidence on the mental health and wellbeing impacts of the pandemic. And we're focusing specifically here on 11 to 16-year-olds. Then we're working with young people to identify priority areas where they feel resources are needed to support them in the short to medium term. And then working with young people to actually create those resources, trying to give them more agency and make sure that we are developing resources that will be engaging and accessible to others their age. So the first part of this work involves trying to pull together a bit of the literature on how the pandemic has been impacting on young people. And I think that much of the research that's been done won't surprise you in terms of its outcomes. So many of the ways that young people have reported reacting to the pandemic and the restrictions that have come with it are not surprising. They include things like feeling lonely, isolated, missing face-to-face contact. So we've got data here from a range of studies, including academic studies and studies from charities. So for example, the mental health charity Mind found that 3/4 of the young people they surveyed felt that loneliness had made their mental health worse. The charity Barnardo's highlighted that loneliness was a key challenge of lockdown. And the Oxwell study, which was conducted in the south of England with school students, reported that 30 to 50% of those participating in their study in secondary schools reported being more lonely, although important to notice that there were a number who also felt that they were less lonely, perhaps because they were out of the school environment, which may have been difficult for them. So essentially, many of these studies do involve surveys with non-representative groups. So we don't want to take too much from individual numbers from any of them, but what we can do is pick up quite consistent themes that run across many of these studies. So as well as isolation and loneliness, another major theme that's come out across the studies is a sense of feeling anxious, stressed and worried around a number of themes: the virus itself, education, its longer term impact. So actually a few studies have been able to look at reports of young people compared to reports from the same young people prior to the pandemic. And so, for example, one study which looked at 13-year-old students actually found lower self-reported levels of anxiety to data that was collected prior to the pandemic when people were surveyed during our first full lockdown, when schools were mostly closed to young people. Others, such as Teen COVID Life, which is based in Scotland, have found stress levels were fairly similar in teenagers, and then others have suggested that anxiety levels appeared to be higher than those reported by other young people prior to the pandemic. So again, a mixed pattern suggesting, unsurprisingly, that the pandemic has really had quite variable impacts on people depending on their personal experiences. The other sort of main theme that comes across the literature is this sense of boredom, there being less fun things to do, and associated changes to normal routine. So a survey from the Children's Parliament in Scotland highlighted increased levels of boredom and a decline in the number of children and young people who felt they had fun things to do. Although the Children's Society highlighted that most children felt that they were coping quite well with the changes, and some reported positive impacts, feeling appreciative of what they did have, having the opportunity to engage in creative activities or to learn at their own pace. However, not spending time with friends, not being able to visit families, and school closures have clearly had bigger impacts for some. And this is something that clearly needs to be highlighted. And as Jo pointed out in her talk, you know, we see huge correlates between particular social and demographic characteristics and young people's mental health. And of course, the pandemic has not been an exception to that, and in fact has probably served to highlight some of those issues further. And so, for example, the charity Mind found that young people who had experience of pre-existing mental health problems were more likely to say that their mental health had declined during lockdown, with 75% of children and young people with pre-existing mental health problems saying that their mental health had got worse, with only 10% feeling that it had got better. And other particular groups that have been highlighted across the research as potentially being particularly vulnerable in this context include Black, Asian and other minority ethnic groups, families living in low incomes, those children who are care experienced, young carers, those with physical disabilities and illnesses, those with special educational needs, those with contact with the justice system, and young people who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, etc. So a number of kind of key vulnerabilities which have already been identified as risk factor for mental health have really been put in the spotlight by the pandemic and the restrictions that it's brought. As I said, much of the research that we're relying on so far does come from surveys such as these that I've mentioned that have typically pulled particular types of people. So, for example, some of the charities do specifically target children and young people with higher levels of mental health difficulties in the first place. And what they've also tended to do is to look at how mental health symptoms are, how young people are getting on at a particular point during the pandemic. But of course, as we'll all know, actually, I think experiences have really changed throughout the pandemic. Very early on, people obviously had no sense of how long things were going to go on for. I think things have gone on for a lot longer than any of us expected. And so there have been different impacts as we've gone along. So in order to try to really track the impact of the pandemic by looking at changes across the pandemic, we've been conducting the COSPACE study, which is essentially a study which includes parents and carers of children and young people between 4 and 16 years of age, and also young people aged 11 to 16 years who provide self-reports. And we launched the study quickly after we went into our first lockdown here in the UK. So that started on the 23rd of March, and we started to recruit to the study on the 30th of March. And we've since then been inviting families to take part and to complete monthly surveys to report on children and young people's mental health symptoms. And over 13,000 parents and carers have taken part so far at some stage and to some extent during the study. And we're continuing to collect data now. And we collect data on a range of different things. Our primary outcome is the Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire, which is a useful measure because it not only measures symptoms, but also interference. So it can give you an indication of likely caseness. And we also consider parental depression, anxiety and stress, as well as specific stressors and COVID-related concerns, and a number of social and demographic characteristics. And we're also looking at other contextual characteristics that have been identified as being associated with resilience in young people, including and also to do with particular COVID-related experiences that are likely to have had quite an impact. So expectations and work being done to do, from school, experiences of COVID itself within the young person and their family, as well as a number of other factors that are listed here. And notably, we did measures that picked up on many of the factors that Jo highlighted, particularly, availability of supportive relationships with others inside and outside of the home. So something that's really important to highlight really is the nature of this sample. So it's not a representative sample. We can't draw conclusions about the proportions of young people experiencing particular difficulties. But what it can let us do is to look at amongst our sample, how do things change over time? And amongst our sample, how do things differ for different groups? So the number of participants included in this table are those who've provided complete data on the Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire at the end of November. And what I just want to particularly highlight are these parts in yellow, where we can see household income and ethnicity, where you can see that this really isn't a representative sample of England and the UK, and we have an affluent sample. So given what we've heard from Jo about the importance of household income on mental health, what we see here is probably a relatively rosy picture of the true state of affairs. So what have we seen in terms of change over time? Well, the first data that I wanted to show reflects how things changed over a month during our first period of full lockdown here in the UK. And we've broken the sample down here as the whole sample. You can see at the beginning, the primary school age group and the secondary school age group. So they're 11 to 16. And actually what was most notable was that amongst our sample, actually, we saw little change over time amongst the secondary school age students. And in fact, we saw a slight decline in emotional symptoms over a month of that first lockdown when secondary school students were out of the school environment. And most of the young people participating in our school were out of school at that time. And that was interesting because actually that was different from the pattern that we saw in younger children, where we saw more marked elevations in all areas, including emotional symptoms, but particularly more behavioural difficulties. And in terms of caseness, this translated into less difficulties, as I said, for the secondary school age students, although there were some elevations in terms of the more sort of behavioural difficulties. This is as reported by parents, so 10% increase in caseness for conduct problems and 7% increase in restlessness, inattentional type problems for the secondary school age students specifically, although those increases were greater amongst the primary school age group. So we were quite struck actually by the fact that we'd seen sort of such higher increases in difficulties amongst the younger children, and this was sort of contrary, I think, to what many expected, given that adolescence is such the time that we see such an elevation in mental health difficulties. So I think it is really important, again, to think about our sample and the experiences that they were having during lockdown. So one of the things that was particularly striking was that among our sample, the vast majority of adolescents were interacting regularly with peers during lockdown. So you can see when you look at were they interacting in some form or other, actually over 80% of the teenagers in our study were having regular communication with peers, so often through text messages, through social media, videos, etc. And actually, and for many boys, it was also for gaming as well. And so that's one thing that's really important to take into account, that we need to look into further with our data, to because it certainly seems to make sense that for what we see amongst our primary school age group is a very low level of interaction with peers, and that was a group where we found more heightened difficulties. So we definitely need to pay close attention to adolescents who have been particularly cut off but from peers during the COVID context. The other thing that was notable in our sample in terms of things that differed between the primary and the secondary age group was levels of stress, wider stress within the family. So we asked parents about how able they felt to sufficiently meet the needs of their work and their children. And we basically found that amongst the primary school age group, unsurprisingly, parents were reporting higher levels of stress on various measures. And so in relation to not at all feeling on top of meeting the needs of their work and their children, we were much more likely to see that amongst the parents of primary school age children, and the parents of teenagers were much more likely to feel they were completely on top of everything in that regard, which is perhaps unsurprising given that the demands for parents were obviously huge for those with young children who were trying to work, to homeschool, to keep their children occupied and so on. So another factor that we clearly need to look at going forward is the role of family stress in relation to young people's adjustment during that time. And amongst our population, those levels were relatively low amongst the adolescents, but we clearly need to keep a careful eye on those adolescents where that wasn't the case. But also really important to pay attention to particular groups who have particular vulnerabilities. And Jo really highlighted the role of income and inequality. So these graphs show you data for children and young people who were essentially living in poverty, so a UK income of less than £16,000 a year. And then the lighter green is those who have a family income of more than £16,000 a year. And essentially what you can see is whichever age group you look at, you can see a clear gap in the level of mental health symptoms across the board of the different types of outcomes that we're looking at, with the green bars consistently being higher, representing throughout the pandemic increased levels of mental health difficulties amongst those families in low incomes. We didn't actually in our population see a widening of the difference, but I think it certainly spotlights what we already knew and what hasn't gone away, which is that these families are at far increased risk. And that translated into really quite marked differences in levels of caseness. So if we focus here on the secondary school age, you can see in the dark green bars, the group who are have a household income of less than 16,000. And we were seeing that, for example, for emotional difficulties here, that over twice as many young people were likely to have meet caseness criteria if they lived in a low income household. And actually it was similarly around double the rate amongst when we looked at both behavioural problems, restlessness, inattention as well. So all of that data is very much focused on looking at that period when we were in full lockdown at the beginning of the pandemic. So how have things changed since then? So we've been continuing to plot symptoms and how they've changed. So the previous graphs we've looked at are very much reflected the periods here in red. But what you could see is essentially amongst the primary school age children in all domains, we saw, this is the yellow bar, we saw difficulties continue to increase and peak in around June. And then from July, which is when in England schools closed for the summer, partway through July, the demands of homeschooling will have reduced. Parents may have had holidays, other things might have been happening. Since then, things have started to continued to reduce. In the secondary school age students, which are in blue, you can see things are flatter overall, with a sort of flatter pattern. However, for the sort of restlessness and attention problems, we also saw this gradual increase that peaked around June, which has then stabilised since. However, of course, looking at these overall patterns, as we've already seen, really misses the variation of experiences that different young people have had during the pandemic. So we've also looked at how young people's trajectories of symptoms have changed throughout the pandemic. So for example, when we look at emotional problems, we've been able to see that actually about half of the young people who've taken part in the study have had very low levels of problems all the way through the pandemic. And that's not surprising, and it fits with what Jo was saying about the different sort of stages that we see. So about half of the young people are here. But what you can also see is that there are different groups, some groups that started with a low level of symptoms and those increased, and others who started with higher levels of symptoms, some who've seen some benefit and others who've maintained very high levels of symptoms throughout. And again, we see a very similar pattern where we look at the restlessness, inattention scores here, where you can see there are clearly some where things have been absolutely fine throughout, some who have struggled all the way through, and others where things have really changed for them during the pandemic. So we then looked at these groups and then tried to understand who these groups were and how they differed. And a few things have jumped out quite clearly already. These are very sort of hot off the press analyses. However, what we can see is that for the emotional problems, those who started with high levels of scores were typically from low income families, and for emotional problems were more likely to be female, in keeping with what Jo mentioned earlier on. And when we look at those who end up with moderate to high scores, they are also, so they're low income and female, but also parents reported higher levels of stress at the beginning of the pandemic and also higher levels of conflict within the family. So those baseline variables at the start of lockdown seem to be associated with who ended up with sort of moderate to high level difficulties in emotional problems as things continued. And similarly for restlessness and attentional problems, low income, again, a very clear predictor of those who had significant problems at the beginning and continued to have them throughout, but we also were more likely to see the higher levels of problems by the end amongst those who were male, in this case for the younger age group, but also again where there was high levels of parental stress, also where there were special educational needs and low levels of immediate family support. So where the family were isolated and didn't have others that they could call on. And again, where we saw high levels of conflict within the family early in lockdown. So these give us highlight a number of things that it seems important for us to pay attention to. And I guess one of the clear messages is when we look at these studies overall and we look at the means, in some cases it might look like there's not a lot going on, but actually that masks the fact that there are particular groups who have particularly struggled during lockdown, and we need to, and everything else that's gone with it, and we really need to be making sure that that's not lost in this wider data. And there is also a huge amount that we could be doing to address this. And one of the challenges, of course, is that with research, we're always playing catch up. So here we've got data, we've talked about data up to sort of September, October, but here we are in December. How are things now? So one of the ways that can be we felt will be really useful for us to think about, well, so going forwards, how should we learn from this research and what should we do about it, is by working with young people to reflect on the research findings and to think with them about what they feel the priorities are based on their experiences, based on the research going forwards. So we've been really delighted to work with Jo and her group, the Triumph Network, to develop some priority setting work where we've shared this research with young people and then got their reflections on what we need to be doing going forwards. So we've been reaching out and trying to involve young people and in a number of different ways. So we developed a priority setting with young people through the Triumph Network, and then a number of different organisations took part in it. So for example, we had groups taking part online from youth clubs in Wales. We had a large school in Scotland who conducted groups with their school population, and we also sort of made it available for individuals to have a go at as well. And there's obviously a lot on this slide. I think the main thing to highlight is that generally the various sort of emotions and that were highlighted in the research were generally pretty well endorsed across the board. So on the whole, it seems that people felt that they were able to relate to the sorts of themes that were coming out of the research. And that also was true for when we looked at sort of different aspects of lifestyle that had changed, that they felt had an impact on their mental health. So you can see here ones that particularly stand out include, disruption to school and exams, as well as things like being able to spend less time outside, spending less time with friends and so on. And I think these themes very much come across from the own words that the young people used when they were reflecting on the research and thinking about how young people were feeling at this stage. Some really jump out, same sorts of themes: feeling bored, feeling worried, feeling stressed, feeling confused, feeling lonely. So we then met with our young people's advisory group to reflect on both the research and also to reflect on the involvement work that we'd done and what people had told us, and ask them to really think about, well, what are going to be the most important things that we focus on when producing resources and trying to support young people at the moment. And so we have a younger young people's advisory group who are sort of 11 to 14 years of age. And so you can see here that they prioritised helping young people with stress and anxiety, supporting people with feeling isolated, coping with stress and changes around school particularly. We also have an older young people's advisory group who are 15 to 24, and many of whom had experiences of mental health difficulties when they were a bit younger. And they again prioritise very similar things: loneliness, feeling isolated, coping with change, feeling anxious, coping with uncertainty. And then we took those sort of top themes that seemed to be coming out, one about feeling connected versus lonely and isolated, feeling unmotivated, bored and flat, coping with change, uncertainty, and put that out in an Instagram poll with one of our partners, Fully Focused Productions. And you could see here that they particularly highlighted that they feel that going forwards over into the winter, this sort of feeling unmotivated, bored and flat seemed to be they felt was a particularly priority area for them when they thought about 11 to 16-year-olds and their current needs, as well as followed by coping with ongoing change and uncertainty. So these really came across as the highlights from when we took the research that we'd done. We spoke to young people about it and got a sense from them about where do we need to focus our efforts now. And the other thing that they really highlighted was that they were really struck by how many young people who took part in the participation exercises highlighted not knowing where to go for help. And the young people in our advisory group were very struck by actually there is quite a lot of help out there, but clearly people don't know where to get it. So there's an important piece of work that also needs to be done about how to get different sorts of help to young people. And I think this very much picks on Joe's message from the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health about using appointments to signpost to good quality information, because there's a minefield of people to understand what to get hold of. So that's clearly a really important message to get across, as well as helping young people to feel connected, overcome loneliness and isolation, to feel more motivated, less bored and flat, and to find ways to cope with the ongoing change and uncertainty that brings stress, confusion and worry. So we're now continuing to work on this, and we're working with some really exciting partners, including a young people's film company and a young people's journalism organisation that's fully focused on headliners, to directly create resources with young people, with many other fantastic partners. So we're looking forward to doing that ourselves, but clearly there's only going to be a small amount that we can do. It'll be the tip of the iceberg. So we'd love to encourage you to take some of this forward yourselves too. So thanks very much, Joe, for hosting us and organising us today. And thanks everyone for joining us.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Cathy. That was a really fascinating presentation, and it's really helpful to kind of unpick a little bit the wider social and emotional impact that COVID's had beyond the immediate kind of health impacts that others will be discussing over the next couple of days, and some really interesting age differences, and also some really stark and sad, fairly socioeconomic differences to think about. I'm sure many of those patterns are similar in other countries, so hopefully we have people with us this morning from other countries. So please do submit your questions, but also feel free to share with us what you've been finding from experiences of lockdown and pandemic restrictions in your own countries. It'd be helpful to know whether these are similar patterns elsewhere. So I think you're able to submit your questions, and we will then take those forward in the final panel session at the end of this session. But firstly, we have a third presentation, which is looking at suicide and suicide prevention in young people. So I'm delighted to welcome Professor Rory O'Connor to the session. As I said before, Rory is Professor of Health Psychology at the University of Glasgow, and he also leads the Suicidal Behaviour Research Laboratory there and is head of the Institute of Health and Wellbeing. So thank you, Rory. I shall hand over to you now. You'll need to unmute yourself, Rory, first.
I was so overwhelmed by my over promotion there, Joe. I'm not quite the head of the Institute of Health and Wellbeing, but rather the head of mental health and wellbeing bit. Okay, so I'm delighted to be here. So thanks, Joe, for organising this session. I think after hearing Joe's and Cathy's brilliant presentations, I think what I've got to say really complements what has already been said, and highlighting, I think one of when we look at young people's mental health, this whole idea that we need to look at sort of subgroups and different individuals who are differentially vulnerable. And I think that's a key message that I'll try and convey as well. Now, what I'll focus in on is probably the most devastating end of the spectrum when we think about mental health, is people dying by suicide, dying by their own hand, and also individuals who engage in self-harm. Now, over the next 25, 30 minutes, what I'll try to do, though, is talk about a number of different things. So I'll focus, I will talk about adolescence, but I'll also maybe extend beyond from whatever, depending on how you define adolescence. Like Sarah Jane Blakemore talks about adolescence now in his mid-20s. So I'll extend into that range as well. But what I'll try and do is there's probably three key things I'm hoping to convey today. One is give us some sense of the epidemiology suicide and self-harm. Then in terms of looking at our understandings of why people die by suicide or people engage in self-harm, I'll talk a bit about the integrated motivational volitional model. So the IMV model, there's some lorry going past me at the minute, you may hear. And then I'm looking at this, the emergence of suicidal thoughts, as well as this pathway from thinking about suicide or self-harm to acting on your thoughts. And then I just thought I would also touch on some of the COVID-related work we've been doing, and I think it really does complement quite nicely what has been said already. So with that sort of broad context, if we look at the most extreme, the most devastating outcome, actually not that long ago, CATHY and colleagues published a meta-analysis of the worldwide suicide rates in adolescents. And again, this slide will be difficult to read if you're on a laptop, but I'll just highlight the key messages. So the key messages, first of all, is this looks at suicide from the age of 10 right through to 19. And what's, I suppose, the key point is that as we know that before puberty, suicide rates and suicide and self-harm are pretty rare. But as we then increase through our adolescent year, well, from 10 up to through our adolescent years, rates of suicide and self-harm increase. And that's borne out by these data. If we look at this first table, table 1, what we can see here in the red boxes are this, that overall, if we look at everyone, that you can see it's really rare in terms of the estimates and rates per 100,000 before the age of 14. Now, obviously, some instances, as we know, 12, 13, 14, you obviously puberty. And then, but we can see then the rate really has jumped by the time you get to age 15 and 15, 16 through to 19 here. It's also worth highlighting that although self-harm itself is most commonly amongst females, the stark reverse pattern of suicide is already evident. It's already evident by teenage years. So if we look at suicide across the lifespan, in most Western countries, there's at least a 2 to 3-fold differential in favor of men dying by suicide versus women. And that's already established by the ages of 50, basically, if we compare the suicide rates of males and females in these data. Now, what's also worth noting is that if we look at by age 15 to 19, we've almost like 3-fold difference between males and female suicide rates. And in addition, another key finding from this study, which looked at a whole range of different countries' populations, which is available to the World Health Organization, we can just see our key methods there. Sadly, that's obviously methods of suicide or hanging and basically jumping in front of obviously a moving object. The challenge with hanging is obviously it's so difficult to intervene if we look at public health interventions in non-institutional settings. So if we look then at trends across the last 10 or 20 years, there's definitely evidence that the suicide rates of all have, against the backdrop of the world suicide rates up until 2018 decreasing, we have started to see this increasing rates of suicide amongst young people, but in particularly amongst young girls. And that is concerning, and it's something we need to explore in more detail. If we then look at non-fatal suicidal behaviour, in particular self-harm, I'm using the definition that in the UK, we've got the National Institute of Health and Care Excellence, and the definition we use there is any form of self-injurious behaviour, irrespective of motive, irrespective of whether somebody was suicidal or not. That's what I'm talking about when I talk about self-harm here. Here's some data from a schools-based study. We did the Scottish data and the Northern Irish data, and then other colleagues elsewhere collected the data in the other parts of England and the Republic of Ireland. And the key take-home message here is that by the age of 16, at least 20 or at least 10% of young people will have self-harmed. And we focus in on girls, 20% of girls will have self-harmed at least once by the age of 16, with the majority of that self-harm being in the previous 12 months. And again, if we look at other European countries, you'll see there's some fluctuations up and down, but that 10% is probably a pretty stable. So for example, there's higher rates of self-harm in Belgium compared to the Netherlands, obviously 2 neighbouring countries. So there are obviously regional and national variations, but overall, I think this 10% figure, which is probably on the increase as well, gives us some indication of the scale of the challenge or the scale of the distress. And then more recently, we conducted the the Scottish wellbeing study. And what the Scottish wellbeing study was is this national study, nationally representative, people interviewed in their homes of 3,500 young adults aged 18 to 34. Now, the reason for including it here is when we look at these data with regard to self-harm and suicide attempts, if we look at the first onset of self-harm or suicide attempts, it's in the teenage years, and then the next slide will give that in particular detail. But I want to just highlight here in this detailed analysis, the most detailed study I'm aware of this age group of 18 to 34 looking at suicide and self-harm, suicide attempts and self-harm, because there tends to be lots of research on adolescents and then lots of research on clinical populations, but actually there often is this gap of what happens to people when they leave school, move into either other forms of further or higher education or into unemployment or the workforce. So the stark finding here though is overall from that age group, what we see is 16% of them have reported that they've self-harmed at some stage, and 11% of them have told us that they have attempted suicide. Now then, if we break that down in terms of the age groups within our sample, just to highlight this pattern of the trajectory of, in this case, this key indicator of mental health outcomes, if we just, doesn't matter if we look at men or women or all adults, it's the same pattern, is what we see is this increase. If we just look at all adults for suicide attempt, or for, let's say, suicidal thoughts, we can see that 21% of people at age 18 to 23 tell us that they have thought about suicide. Then there's an increase, a bit of an increase then to 24 to 29, but that seems to the peak. And then there's a slight decline in the older age group. And in each of these indicators on this slide, you see the same pattern, and it doesn't matter if you look at males or females. So what we see then is, if we add that to the data from our adolescent data, we see this increase through to basically our mid-20s up to 29 on average in terms of this prevalence of suicidal thoughts, behaviors, and self-harm. And then we move on and look at, what may be causing these factors. This is a review we published now a few years ago in the Lancet, and it basically, all of these factors hold. You can see in the panel on the right-hand side, we've got a whole range of risk factors here, and there will be no surprises to any of us in the audience. So there's a whole range of social and psychological factors that are associated with suicide risk and risk of self-harm, and many of these factors were sort of illustrated in what Cathy and Joe said, and we can focus in here on obviously social inequality. Social inequality is such a huge predictor of suicide and self-harm. And again, this iceberg model again is quite useful to think about, because again, if we look at the above the water, thank God the majority of people who think about suicidal thoughts or engage in self-harm never die by suicide. But for example, in the United Kingdom, we've got at least maybe around 6,000 people across the lifespan who self-harm, who die by suicide. And then those who present to clinical services, where it really are in the tens of thousands. But what the adolescent data show us is a hidden scale, because of those 10% of people of adolescents who self-harm, or 20% of girls who self-harm, most of that's hidden, because again, the data would suggest that less than 20% of people who self-harm in adolescence actually come in contact with clinical services. So what we also did in this paper was try to put together into some meaningful framework the complexity, the range of different factors associated with suicide and self-harm in young people and adolescents. And this pathway model just gives us some sense of that complexity. And again, I'm not going to go into the details, but recognizing that obviously for us to understand suicide and self-harm, we have to recognize the biological vulnerability factors. So for example, we know that suicide across the lifespan is associated with dysregulation of the serotonin system, but the dysregulation of the serotonin system is implicated in a whole range of other problems and behaviors. So it's not a particularly specific marker. We know that suicide and self-harm usually occurs in the context of some form of mental health problem, but again, not a specific enough marker, because indeed we know that of those people who die by suicide across the lifespan, maybe 90% of people will have a mental health problem, most commonly depression. But the reality is most people with mental health problems never die by suicide and don't even attempt suicide. So again, understanding the broader mental health context is important, but it's not an explanatory variable. It doesn't help us get inside this sort of black box in the middle here of understanding the emergence of a particular type of distress that for some people leads them to become suicidal, and for others leads them to, in other respects, use self-harm as a way of alleviating the pain they're experiencing. And that's really what I'm going to focus on now, is trying to get inside that black box of the emergence of suicidal thoughts or thoughts of self-harm. And then crucially, there's other key question of not only to understand why self-harm or suicidal thoughts emerge, but what makes it more likely that somebody makes that transition. And that led me then to published in 2011, first of all, and then the integrated motivational volitional model, which was my attempt at trying to understand the sort of complexity of the factors associated with the emergence of suicidal thoughts and the transition from thoughts to attempts, but bring that together into a way which was meaningful in a theoretical context, but also helpful clinically, and also to help people themselves understand why they feel the way they do, and then hopefully then we can build interventions to alleviate that risk. So we first published in 2011, and then with my colleague Olivia Kirtley, we updated the model, the IMV model, in 2018. So I'm just going to highlight some key messages, some key premises that underpin the model, which hopefully help us understand both self-harm and suicide risk in children and adolescents. So in effect, the model is in three parts. In the left-hand side here, we've got the pre-motivational phase. But in one simple way of describing it, it's just a background context in which suicidal thoughts and behaviors may emerge. And it recognizes that we all bring different vulnerability factors. It recognizes that all forms of mental health problems and their manifestation, in this case, self-harm and suicide, happen in the context of social disadvantage, in terms of that steep curve or slope in which you're from more socially disadvantaged backgrounds, your risk of self-harm and suicide is elevated. Now, that's not to take away from the fact that, of course, suicide and self-harm happen to people irrespective of social background. So we know there are key environmental influences. And we also know that people who die by suicide experience a disproportionate number of negative life events, in particular, clear evidence of early life adversity, which obviously is really can start to manifest itself in children and adolescents. But just in the instance of brevity, the other two key messages of the model is, if we're trying to understand the emergence of suicidal thoughts, two key factors are important. So it's people who feel defeated and humiliated from which they cannot escape. And it's this sense of entrapment, this mental pain of entrapment, which is a key driver or the key part of the key final common pathway to the emergence of suicidal thoughts. So in essence, suicidal thoughts emerge when we feel defeated and humiliated. And often what contributes to that is a sense of loss or a sense of shame or rejection. And social rejection is so important in adolescence, but it's that sense of entrapment which is key. And then the last bit of the model, the third phase, is the volitional phase. So the thing to do with suicidal thoughts is the motivational phase. The thing to do with whether you act on your thoughts is the volitional phase. And again, the best evidence we have is about 1/3 of people make the transition from thinking about suicide to acting on their thoughts. And we'll return to this key challenge of understanding the factors that determine whether you act on your thoughts, because the argument here is the factors that determine or increase the likelihood that you'll act on your thoughts of suicide, which I call volitional factors or volitional moderators, are different from the factors that lead you to become suicidal. So this is about becoming suicidal. And then this right-hand bit, the third phase, is whether you'll act on your thoughts of suicide. And we and others have done lots of studies now looking at different aspects of these sort of psychological processes, again, in different populations and different age groups. And we've demonstrated, and others have demonstrated now in numerous studies, that entrapment is a key, this sense of mental pain that you're trapped by, either mental pain of thoughts going on, if I'm a worthless person going on in your head, or it could be you feel trapped by life circumstances, external factors are trapping you. So we have lots of studies, again, in young people and adolescents, as well as across right through the lifespan in clinical and non-clinical populations. And we've also demonstrated in numerous studies, not just us, but others, of this key pathway of going from defeat to entrapment to suicidal thinking. So again, these have been demonstrated in clinical and non-clinical populations in young people and older people. So the key message thus far, though, is if we're trying to understand the emergence of suicidal thoughts, we need to think about what other factors make it more likely that a young person will feel defeated, what other factors will make it much more likely that a young person feels trapped, such that they see suicidal thoughts as this way of coping with that distress and as a way of ending the pain. So they know that if they're suicidal, if they're feeling so bad, then the ultimate way of ending their pain or ending or solving their problems. And then the last bit about I want to just talk about in the model is this. So entrapment is really important for the emergence of suicidal thoughts. But I've made the case for this idea that people who are thinking about suicide, thankfully, most people don't go any further. They just have thoughts of suicide. But there still is this 1/3 of people who make this transition. And this slide here is the volitional phase of my model. So that's that third phase I showed you in a couple of slides ago. And what it argues is it's these 8 factors, I won't go through them in detail today, but these factors like impulsivity, like basically overcoming the fearlessness about dying, or having a mental image of dying and death, or knowing somebody else who's died by suicide, attempted suicide. The presence of these key factors increase the likelihood that you go from thinking about suicide to attempting suicide. And just going back to the Scottish wellbeing study, we've tested this and numerous other studies. We try to understand what are the factors that differentiate thoughts about suicide, so the suicide ideation group, from people who attempt suicide. And according to my model, those 8 factors in that previous slide, the volitional factors are key to understand that transition, to understand that difference. So again, when we just do the multivariate analysis, in this study of our representative sample, people completed all of these measures confidentially, the sensitive measures confidentially on a computer. And I've simply just compared in a multivariate model those individuals who thought about suicide from those who've attempted suicide. And according to my model, defeat and entrapment are important in the emergence of suicidal thinking, for example, but they're not key to this transition. And that's where the volitional phase factors come in. So then if we just look at the key findings, that's exactly what turns out, what emerges. So when I just look at the ideation group versus the suicide attempt group, they don't differ at all in a multivariate model on these other factors which we think are key to the emergence of suicidal thoughts, not the transition. But then when we look at the volitional phase factors, exactly as the model predicts, people who attempt suicide are much more likely to be impulsive. They're much more likely to have what's called the capability for suicide. That's this combination of being less fearful about dying, as well as being able to withstand physical pain. And they're also much more likely to have a friend who's attempted suicide. So really consistent with the AMV model, highlighting the importance of these volitional factors. And then surprisingly though, we didn't find any difference in people's experience of having a family member who'd attempted suicide or knowing a family member who died by suicide. Now we think this absence of findings here illustrates basically that the influence of peers is much more important in older age groups. Okay, so that's just a couple of slides. There's other studies. These are all available on our website, suicideresearch.info, which just demonstrates the same findings I've just illustrated in a Scottish sample. This is an English sample of college students. This is a sample of adolescents, a large scale, whatever, 5,000 school-age kids. We find exactly the same findings with adolescents with regard to self-harm. And then more recently, led by Becky Mars at Bristol using the ALSPAC cohort, we find that obviously the ALSPAC cohort doesn't have all of the IMV variables, but those key factors, those key volitional phase factors of previous behavior and exposure, knowing somebody else who self-harm, predicts suicidal behavior in young people over time. So really consistent findings here. But what I want to just move on to very quickly is something very different that we do to try and understand maybe the difference between thinking about suicide and attempting suicide. And that's to look at the stress response and looking at obviously, we know we need to release cortisol when our body is experiencing threat. And our hunch here is that people who attempt suicide, that their cortisol system isn't working as effectively, and that when they encounter stressors, that they're much more likely to release less cortisol. If you release less cortisol, the body's less prepared to actually basically cope with that response or respond most adaptively. And the reason I'm including this is because, as you'll see in a few slides' time, childhood trauma is an important marker of how much cortisol you can release in adulthood. This is work I've done. I've got an identical twin brother who's a stress researcher. And this is work I've done in collaboration with him. And this is obviously a moment of humor, a moment of levity in what is otherwise a pretty intense talk. So the key message of this talk, which is concerning, is what on earth, how big are my knees when I was a child? So and apparently they're called milk knees. Somebody told me recently at a talk. But this is work, as I say, getting back to the serious business, which we've done with Darryl. But what, again, just to highlight, what I've touched on thus far is more epidemiological work. This is experimental based work where we bring people into our lab. These are adults. And so, of course, it's an adult sample, but you'll see why it's relevant in a second with regard to the childhood trauma stuff. So we've got a group of people, again, the same sort of design, people who think about suicide, people who've attempted suicide, and then people with no history. Now, what we're doing in this study is we're doing an experimental induction of stress in the laboratory, which we know activates the stress system. And throughout this study, we're assessing cortisol through saliva. And what our hypothesis is that people who attempt suicide are releasing less cortisol, and that's index N of a dysregulation of the cortisol system. And so this is just the broad design. Do not worry about the details. It just illustrates that throughout the study, we basically are assessing cortisol levels, and about 15 minutes in, we do the stress induction. And that's where I'm hoping to see people's levels of cortisol to increase, because that's what we need, the body's fight or flight response. And what you'll see in a slide's time is we see a much flattened response in people who've attempted suicide. So as I've trailed the findings, this is why it's important. So what I've touched on thus far, the importance of these psychological markers in the context of entrapment as a psychological marker of suicidal risk. What we can see here is just cortisol levels. This is when we do the stress induction. Here are 3 groups. And what's pretty clear is that the people who've a history of suicide attempts have this flattened response. So they're releasing less cortisol than even the people who've only thought about it, but have never acted on their thoughts. And obviously the people who've no suicidal history are reporting the most, are releasing the most cortisol. So good evidence here. We're trying to think about the risk of suicide and self-harm. We need to look at the cortisol system. Now, one of the things I said earlier was, even though this is an adult sample, we know that people who've attempted suicide tend to come from more socially disadvantaged backgrounds and tend to also experience more childhood trauma, well, obviously as children. And actually, we looked at this directly in this study. We said, well, actually, what might explain these changes in cortisol? And in that study, we had assessed childhood trauma. And this slide, all I want you to take from this slide is that in the suicide attempt group, 80% of our suicide attempt group had reported some form of childhood trauma, and they were significantly higher on each of our markers of childhood trauma. But then when we asked the question, does the childhood trauma, or what they tell us they experience as children, maybe 15, 20 years before we saw them in the lab, does it predict how much cortisol they release in our study today when we do the experimental induction? And the answer is yes. So this, again, I'll just highlight the key message here. So there's our cortisol again, and we've got people here who reported high levels of childhood trauma. They have the flattest response. So let's just think about that for 1 second before I then move on to the final few slides. So think about that, this idea that what people told us happened to them as children. The average age of the sample is 30, which happens to maybe up to the age of 16, is still having some impact on how their body is responding to stress, especially these people who've previously been suicidal, have either thought about or attempted suicide, and that's predicting their cortisol levels today. And it illustrates a challenge we have. We think about the intervening in terms of protecting people through the lifespan from the adverse effects of childhood trauma. Okay, so the last thing I want to do in my sort of whistle-stop tour is touch on some of the work we've been doing on the mental health and well-being in the pandemic. Now this hopefully complements what CATHY said in particular, whereas CATHY's is obviously looking at parents and then obviously children and adolescents. We're focusing on an adult sample of people 18 or from 18 and over. So again, we did it very quickly after the pandemic began. We got ethical approval and secured funding from our various partners here to try and monitor people's health and well-being over the pandemic. And what I'm just going to talk about at this stage are the data we've recently published from the first 6 weeks of lockdown. Although it's a non-probability sample, in terms of our quotas for the nationally representative of the UK population, it was pretty close. Although of course there's digital exclusion, and so any findings I'll report today are probably underestimates. And I'm just going to focus in on our suicidal ideation data for the purposes of today. So again, this paper is freely available on our website and on the British Journal of Psychiatry's website. So what I want to say is, I want to say maybe 3 key messages before I finish. One is, when we're looking at the mental health impacts across the pandemic, we need to look at different indicators of well-being. Have I frozen? Ah, it looks as if I've frozen. Am I back? Okay.
We can still hear you, Rory. It's fine.
Okay, because I froze and I could see myself like this. It was not a good view. Okay, so we need to look at different indicators of mental health, because what you'll see is different trajectories depending on the indicator you look at. And then the other issue is we need to look beyond these top level findings of the impact, because there's no way in this world that we're all in this pandemic together. And that's absolutely clear. There's so many groups who are more adversely affected than others. So first, if we just look at anxiety and depression, and then I'll focus in on the suicidal thoughts. Now, again, it's really important to caveat this with, and Cathy made this point as well, is a lot of the research, including ours, we do not have pre-pandemic levels of well-being. So although we've obviously got a national sample, we can't say anything about people's mental health and well-being before the pandemic. But what the focus of this study, for the data I'm talking about here, is we've got 3 data points across those 6 weeks, those first 6 weeks of the pandemic in the United Kingdom, and we're looking at trajectories and change. So again, what's key here is, as other people had reported, there was this elevated levels of anxiety, and the pre-pandemic data support this. There's much elevated levels of anxiety, but there's a sharp recovery. Now, these levels of anxiety are still much higher than you would expect in non-pandemic times, but there's clear evidence of this recovery. Now, if we just look across everybody, the levels of depressive symptoms seem to be pretty stable. Slight reduction, but pretty stable. Now, where we start to see, I think, particularly concerning patterns is in our thoughts about suicide items. So what we see here is the reverse pattern from the anxiety levels. We see this creeping increase in the emergence of suicidal thoughts. And the key question is, well, why might that be? And the reason that might be the case is because if we think about how we tend to routinely assess symptoms of depression and symptoms of anxiety using the GAD-7 or the PHQ-9, they ask us about how we're feeling or how we felt in the previous 2 weeks. So they're oriented to the past. Whereas for us to answer the question about suicidal thoughts, we have to orient to the future. So I think what this is tapping is people's concerns and anxieties as they look to the future. And again, if we then hone in on, move beyond this top level findings, the groups who are most affected are young people. And again, this is consistent with other data as well. But the young people, by wave 3 towards the end of lockdown, and well, this is early May, 14% of our young people are reporting some suicidal thoughts by comparison to our older group who are really protected. And then if we look, there's a marginal effect here of gender differences, but although in the depression and anxiety findings, there was much higher levels of depression and anxiety and other indicators of mental health in females compared to males, that's not as clear in the suicidal data. And then the point that's been made now repeatedly is this social disadvantage and this social inequalities. It's clear here in our data as well. And then in loneliness, just to bring this sort of to a close, in loneliness, we have a load of other markers. And again, if you're interested, there are more details in the paper. We also look at loneliness. Again, we see key evidence of the young people reporting higher levels of loneliness. Now, we haven't done a more detailed analysis yet of that 18 to 23 versus 24 to 29-year-old group, because again, if you think back to our other Scottish National Survey of Wellbeing, it seems to be much more acute before pandemic in these 18 to 23-year-old groups rather than these 25 to 29-year-old group. Okay, so that's really all I wanted to say today. I want to just try and bring it all together. So what I've tried to illustrate is that there's definitely, I think, evidence now that suicidal thoughts and behaviors and deaths by suicide are increasing in adolescence and young adulthood. and I presented some data illustrating that increase from 10-year-old right through to 19-year-olds. I've tried to illustrate the importance and utility of using theoretical models to try and bring together that complexity, to understand how all of those factors like social isolation or social disconnection, or the fact that maybe I feel social rejection, or that my life opportunities have been affected, how they impact holistically on how an individual thinks about their present, their past, and their future, because that's how we'll then intervene to help the most vulnerable. I've tried to make the point about thinking about the factors that lead somebody to becoming suicidal are different from the factors that lead us to act on our thoughts, and intervention should be targeted accordingly. And that even though the picture is still unclear really about who is especially affected in this pandemic, I think without doubt we have clear evidence that young people in terms of social demographics really have been badly affected, as well as young people then who tend to be, who are female and who have pre-existing mental health problems and from socially disadvantaged backgrounds. Our data support that they're even more affected. And I think that we know enough now that we need to be doing much more now urgently to protect our young people so that they don't become this lost generation of the future. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Rory. That was a really comprehensive and fascinating presentation. And I loved that what you talked about with the stress response and the cortisol. It just reinforces the importance of the relationships between the social and the biological and the psychological, how they're so integrated. Absolutely. Which makes it obviously so challenging for us as well. But that was fascinating. Thank you. So we now have time for about 20-25 minutes for some questions. I see some questions have now appeared in the chat, so that's brilliant. We'll work through those, and if you do still have any other questions that you'd like to put to any of the panelists, then please do add them into the chat now, or if you'd like to make some comments from your own perspective or experiences as well, we'd love to hear from you. So there's a comment here, first of all. So given the increasing problems of mental health in schools after COVID, are we in danger of expecting our teachers to act as mostly untrained mental health support workers? So I think that's the first question. I'll take that one first. So I don't know, Cathy, if you wanted to respond to that one.
Yes, yeah, very happy
first
to.
Of all.
I mean, I think one of the things that has been clear is the extent to which young people are reliant on people within school settings to help to direct them to support when they need it. And so, for example, in England, referrals to child and adolescent mental health services really dropped down when we went into lockdown to start with. And a lot of that was because difficulties weren't being flagged up in schools, and that has increasingly become a route to highlight difficulties and help families to get the support that they need. So it's clear that schools are a really critical setting for identifying and potentially addressing difficulties. But I think the person who asked the question is absolutely right. It's a real danger that we don't then put the whole responsibility for sorting the problem out to teachers. Colleagues of mine have done a lot of work with teachers to understand more about their experiences of managing mental health within the school setting and what they're comfortable with. And what's very clear is that many school staff are very keen to be able to support young people. They want to be able to identify problems that are there, but they really don't, and absolutely appropriately, want to be put in a position of being the person that is relied upon to address the problem. So teachers need to be supported to be able to identify problems and to respond appropriately when problems are first raised, and then to feel comfortable and confident that they can then signpost effectively to those who are able to provide support. In England, we've had a really good programme that's been rolled out across the country called Wellbeing for Education Return, which has been for training school staff in exactly those things. So not taking on the role of therapist, but being able to respond on the ground, but also think about wider environmental things in the school climate that can be done that will have positive effects. But of course, if teachers are going to feel comfortable to be able to signpost and direct, it does mean there needs to be other support available, and that's obviously a huge problem. And Jo, in your talk, you obviously highlighted the length that it often takes for young people to access support. So alongside this, it's really critical that we're thinking about ways that we can increase access to effective psychological support for young people when they first need it. I think we've learned a lot in the pandemic about digital responses. They're certainly not going to be the answer for everybody, but they do seem to be very acceptable for many people. So that gives us a good way to increase the efficiency of our approaches and increase access for some. And we're certainly in England increasing the amount of provision of mental health practitioners in schools, and I think that's something that I really hope that we'll see expanded both here and elsewhere.
Great, thank you, Cathy. I think that's really helpful. It's certainly something that schools are talking about a lot, is having to deal with. I mean, pre-pandemic, they were already aware of having to deal with mental health and wellbeing issues amongst school population, and obviously that's been kind of heightened, and many of them feel they don't have sufficient training or background to do that. But and young.
Can I just add a couple of things?
Yeah, of course you can.
No, because just a couple of experiences. I put a mint in my mouth that was badly judged. In Scotland, obviously, we're increasing the provision. I know we're only one country of obviously school counsellors or mental health practitioners in the school setting. But two other things, we're also obviously rolling out in different parts of the country depression and anxiety training, or for young people, not for young, for teachers to support young people. And then actually one thing we're also doing is in Scotland we got what's known as the distress brief intervention program, which is trying to avoid waiting lists. So it was initially piloted in 18 plus. And the whole aim is if you're in distress and you present to the emergency room or emergency department or your GP in some pilot areas or the police, that you would get within 24 hours, you'd be referred into a service, the Stress Brief Intervention Service, which offers up to 14 days of immediate support. No waiting list, immediate support within 24 hours. And we're currently doing now, we've now reduced it down to the age inclusion to 16 and 17-year-olds, and we're now just about in 2021 to pilot that in schools, so the schools have another pathway. So again, but no waiting list, because the waiting list for CAMHS in Scotland are just through the roof, and I assume it's the same in England, and obviously CAMHS is obviously tier 4. So I think we need to look much more innovatively, and I don't think we've done enough of that yet. So I do have a bit of sympathy certainly with the comments, which is I think teachers, there is support there, but teachers' mental health is also needs to be protected, and what they're asked to do now I think is a lot, and it's really difficult for everybody.
Yeah, thanks, Rory. That's really helpful. They've kind of become frontline health workers in some ways, which is not what they trained for. So it's really difficult, but it's great to know that some investment, and obviously it's an area where we need a lot more. The second point here is, thanks, Cathy, for this beautiful research. I have children in this age group. I have decided to, this is not me speaking, this is a question from an attendee. I have decided to home tuition for my son and daughter, but both in A-level, with teachers coming home. But somehow they lost interest in learning what could have happened. So how can, as a parent, you understand that sort of loss in motivation amongst your children during that kind of school closure? Changes?
So it's a really important question, and I think certainly a lot of families have opted to extend home learning even when schools have reopened, either because actually they found that their children and young people seem to thrive in that situation, or because of obviously continuing reasons for concern, particularly for vulnerable families. So in relation to going back into school and busy environments. So I imagine this is something that a lot of families are facing right now. I mean, I guess there's not an easy answer. One thing to say is a bit of reassurance, which is certainly this message is coming across loud and clear from the young people that we're working with, that at this point in the pandemic now, the thing that they're talking about a lot to us is lack of motivation, feeling flat, feeling trapped, which is something I'd like to it'd be great to pick up with Rory more, because clearly a worry, but this very much feeling a lack of inspiration. And I think that is very difficult, and that's something we're going to be thinking with young people about. How can we address that, given that where we are now and that we don't know exactly how things are going to be going forwards. But typically, for example, if we think about treatments for depression, one of the widely used ways of working with young people is behavioural activation, which is all very much about helping young people to really try to notice their values, what's important to them, what makes them feel good in their lives, what makes them feel motivated, and trying to then kind of schedule those sorts of activities into their lives and help them notice that when they do these particular things, they feel good about it in some way or other. They might feel a sense of achievement, feel that they've contributed, etc., etc. So I think it's really going to be about trying to take that kind of approach, helping, rather than us getting into a difficult situation with young people where we're on their case about not doing the work and then they resent us having a go at them for doing the work. Instead, trying to sort of experiment, be curious. I wonder, if you just try a small bit of it, let's see if you try a small bit, how you feel after you've done that, and sort of treat it as an experiment and help them to discover for themselves that some sense of achievement might come from engaging in different and new activities. But I think the other thing, as Jo mentioned, is school pressure does feel huge for many young people, and it feels so overwhelming that sometimes it can lead them to just want to stay away from that, to avoid the whole situation. So also making sure that there is a balance with other sorts of activities that they find rewarding and engaging, which might be a little bit harder to find at the moment and might need a bit of rediscovery and experimentation.
Great, thanks, Cathy. And I think, so much of the conversation and political kind of dialogue has been around school closures, but of course, so many other activities that young people were involved in and that created that structure and routine for young people disappeared as well, didn't they? And they're so essential for not only mental health and well-being, but social support and so many things. And like you say, many of them are still not up and running, so it's still having a big impact, I think, on young people in many ways. Okay, thank you. There's another question here, which is, how has the COVID pandemic affected adolescents with eating disorders? And could you tell us more about eating disorders in LGBTQ adolescents in particular? Now, I'm not sure this is an area of expertise for any of the panelists. Do either of you want to speak to that? Or we may have to refer that question on to other colleagues. And so you're welcome to contact.
I just heard anecdotally from some clinical colleagues that it has been an impact. But I don't know any more detail.
Yeah, okay. So sorry about that. We're probably not in a position to give a very informed response to that one. Okay, so there's a few questions here, Rory, picking up on your talk now. So the early child trauma effects on cortisol response is interesting. We often think very young children, for example, under 1 or 2 years old, won't remember the trauma. Do your cortisol response only apply to trauma that the children can remember? So that's the first one. Do you want to deal with that first?
Yeah, well, our data, because it's a self-report measure of what they remember, or it could have been what somebody's told them happened to them. So I don't think we know the answer to that question in terms of, well, certainly in the context of suicide risk, we certainly do not know the answer to that.
Okay.
But if you think of sort of the epigenetic effects, I wouldn't be surprised if those are very early life experiences that will have an impact. Okay,
thank you. So there was a follow-up, I'm not sure if it's from the same person or not, but is it possible to give the stress hormone cortisol to at-risk adolescents as a possible preventive suicide measure alongside therapy and other interventions?
Yeah, so it's important to highlight, first of all, that cortisol is only one small part of the puzzle here, and so we're not at the stage of going a particular cortisol level or change in cortisol level is associated with any a particular degree of risk, because we have to remember that we can't predict suicide any better than the tossing of a coin, and that's really important to highlight. But having said that, there's some work at looking at synthetic cortisol. Now, but I don't think we know well it works in this context of your impact on longer term mental health. But there is evidence not from the suicide field that, for example, some psychological interventions like mindfulness may be effective in sort of not reversing but improving cortisol response. Because the other thing worth highlighting, if you look at some of our subgroup analysis from that paper, if we looked at when people experienced this, had attempted suicide, a lot of the effect, flattening effect was driven by people who were within a year of a suicide attempt, and that the people who are more historical in their suicide attempts, although their levels didn't go back to the ideation group level, the control group, there was some evidence of recovery. So I think there is some natural recovery, but what we need to do, and one of the things we're trying to look at, is whether we can intervene with psychological interventions to improve that physiological response.
Great. And the final question here for you again, I think, Rory. We are all aware of copycat suicides, especially of celebrities. How can we and our society help our young people in these aspects?
Well, so the stark reality is that when there is a celebrity suicide, there does seem to be, in those weeks immediately following, an increase between 5 and 10% increase in suicide rates. So it is a real effect, which is concerning. Now, in terms of what we can do, there's 2 levels of intervention I would think of. One is we need to, how we deal with celebrity suicides, we have to, both at a public health level or a media level, as well as how we discuss it with our young people or whatever, is we don't talk about the methods, we don't talk about glamorization, we try to recognize it's not one factor leads to a suicide. So, and obviously in the UK recently, obviously Caroline Flack's awful death by suicide, and a lot of the media reporting of that was very simplistic. So we're moving away from simplistic explanations, and then crucially also offering messages of hope. So when we're speaking to our young people, it's important to have these discussions. You need to be careful how you deal with that in a school's context, but if you're speaking to your child as a parent, say, or a caregiver, it's giving messages of hope, recognizing complexity, and that suicide is not the solution, that suicide is a permanent solution to temporary problems.
Yeah. Okay, so, and if I can just pick up on something, I guess along similar lines. So you talked about, defeat and humiliation and entrapment. I guess it's quite difficult to kind of spot those things when a young person's sort of finding themselves at that stage where they're feeling trapped and don't quite know how to deal with what's going on emotionally for them. I mean, and this is relevant, I guess, to families, but also school staff, but also health professionals who might come into contact with young people. Is there any way of really spotting those kind of early signs and intervening in that early stage?
Well, I would be, there's 2 ways to answer that. One is I would definitely be going for, right, we should ask a young person directly, right? How trapped do you feel, right? But there's a standard measure which Paul Gilbert developed years ago, a 16-item measure of entrapment. Now that's no good in a clinical context, but in a clinical context, we've just published this year a 4-item version and a 2-item version. And the 4-item version, the correlation with the 16-item version, which assesses entrapment, is basically the correlation in a general population sample is 0.95 with a 16-item and 0.98, I think it is, for 0.97 for a clinical sample. So there are measures out there and they're on our website. But I would be direct and just ask, and because the other thing to say, which I didn't get a chance to, is the 4 items measure taps both internal entrapment and external entrapment. And internal entrapment is mental pain of just feeling you're useless and a burden and feeling better off if you're dead. And that's much more dangerous than external entrapment. In all of our studies, when you do and not just ours, other studies, when you do the multivariate analysis, it always trumps it. So it's really, and the concern is that can be hidden. And that's why I think asking directly about do you feel trapped, and it's more specific than asking do you feel hopeless, because it tends to be then linked to something. And then the last thing to say on that is the rejection, social rejection stuff. We know from work loads of others like done on that in adolescence, that sense of social rejection is so much more powerful and much more likely to get. And I would often talk about the psychological thin skin of people who have particular personality characteristics like perfectionism, a particular type of perfectionism, which makes it much more likely that that social rejection really gets through the armor, and that bit makes it much more likely to feel defeated, and then much more then likely to move on to this pathway of feeling trapped. And that's why giving options and really like the behavioral activation stuff I think is really helpful in that context. And one of the things we're doing, I'll shut up, is it's Scottish level in our suicide prevention action plan. We're using my model as a way of thinking at all levels of the way a teacher intervenes with a pupil. Does that promote defeat? Does that promote entrapment? Or does it promote empowerment and self-respect? Or in the clinical service, or in how we deal with their parents and their parents losing their job, all that level, right down to individual, how we interact. And I think there's so much we can do in that context.
Brilliant, thanks, Rory. Kathy, I don't know, did you have a question for Rory?
Well, it did really relate to the entrapment issue, I suppose, because I was really struck when...
Right, go on, sorry.
Okay. Well, I was very struck when you were talking, obviously about the emphasis on entrapment, because in our conversations recently with young people, there's been a lot of reference to feeling trapped, and actually we're hearing it a lot more now than we did in early lockdown, which is maybe not surprising as things have continued, and maybe things have continued longer than people thought, and so on. And but what you've just said about internal external entrapment reassures me slightly that the physical circumstances, which I think is what they're mostly speaking about, may be less of a risk. However, I was really interested to hear your thoughts and reflections really on the current situation and risks via increasing risks of people feeling entrapped.
Well, so we have, I only talked about the data up until end of May, but we have now looked at some of our data up until the end of October. And actually the concerning pattern is the suicidal thoughts are continuing to increase. So, and that covers the period where we're not in technical lockdown, obviously. I know they change again, but so I think there's something about that, and as somebody who's got has a teenage daughter, I'm talking to her a lot about it as well, is I think that there is still this whole sense of we are the generation which, well, even before the pandemic, it was a generation of getting more equality for sexual rights, sexual identity rights, the whole climate change stuff. That stuff is really on top of now this. It's like, geez, they're like, you have just really buggered it up for us, that idea. And I think that even on a global level, that is really percolating down. And I just think that there is something about this ongoing thing about kids in school now going, yeah, we're back in school, but my God, my daughter had 2 weeks of isolation. Other kids are doing that. And the inequalities is just going to be remarkable. And I just think that's the bit they're looking at. They don't feel as they've had a fair crack of the whip. And if you look at moving then beyond 18 into the job market, the precarious market, and then it's just a really difficult time for them.
Yeah, and in fact, we had a meeting last night with young people, and one of the things that came up in that was one of them described it as this year it's just been blow after blow after blow, because they are rightly affected by climate change issues, Black Lives Matter, and the non-stop sort of COVID blows, the exams, and so that absolutely echoed what you've just said.
Yeah.
So can I just to say, because we've got about 2 or 3 minutes left. So Rory, if you wanted to ask one more question of Kathy, and then we should wrap up.
Right. Okay. So Kath, I was really struck by your fact. I thought, so you're obviously the age profile stuff, right? So if I understood your data, the impact in the school, the secondary school kids wasn't as bad as I thought it would be, and obviously some recovery. So do you think it's just the fact that you're saying you've got this overrepresented, more affluent sample, or do you think there's something different going on, or what?
Yeah, so we need to look into it really closely. I mean, I think the fact that we have got this fairly affluent sample definitely will have distorted the pattern. However, we were hearing from a lot of families during the sort of earlier phase of lockdown, when young people weren't having to go to school, that their young people were actually finding life much easier without the pressures of secondary school. Whereas we weren't hearing that from primary school age, where obviously they don't have those same pressures, and I think probably would enjoy it a bit more, and also are less able to be independent when they are at home. So actually, we talking to families, for example, where children and young people had pre-existing mental health problems, they were often telling us that their young people were finding life easier. They were worried that those young people were then essentially avoiding things that might be difficult, and it might be hard as they went back. We were also hearing it a lot from parents of children who had special educational needs, where they were finding that being in a different learning environment, being able to learn at their own pace or not learn at all in some cases, relieved lots of stresses. So I think that's definitely a factor which we didn't hear about in the primary school age group. So I don't think it is just our sample. I think that the experience that our young people have in secondary school, and I think this fits with what you were saying, Joe, about the role of sort of school pressure and other stresses within the school environment, I think were really highlighted in that early phase of lockdown. And I think there's a lot we can learn from it going forwards.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah. Thanks, Kathy. That's really helpful. Okay, I think unfortunately we'll have to bring the discussion to an end there. It's fascinating, but we are out of time, so we need to bring it to a close. I would just like to thank both of you, particularly Cathy and Rory, for fantastic presentations. It's really, really been fascinating.
Jo.
Oh, thank you. And of course, please feel free to get in touch with any of us if you want further information or to follow up on anything. But I think now we have a small break for lunch, and sessions will start again in an hour. So we'll close it there. Thanks everyone.